We are running a little bit behind schedule, but I think we should have a little bit of discussion and questions before we have a brief comfort break, and then maybe we'll try to get back onto schedule for the last session. I'm sure there'll be questions from the floor. We've got a roving microphone with Ewa down here, and I think Oliver's upstairs with a roving microphone. If you're upstairs and would like to ask a question, you are allowed to. I know you haven't done yet, but maybe this could be the first session where you do. Just whilst people are thinking, 3 very rich papers, it did strike me as we were listening that, in a sense, we might have titled this session not so much Vanbrugh at Stowe as sort of Vanbrugh's intellectual world. We've heard this morning really about Vanbrugh's political world, and then about his network in terms of building and design in the office of works and so forth. But here we're talking about really the intellectual world that he occupied. And as a non-Vanbrugh specialist, I just wonder if perhaps Tom, Michael, you could say a little bit more about that and who's doing what. Is it Cobham? Is it Vanbrugh? What are they doing at the Kit Kat Club? Not having 3 hours of wine followed by 3 days of misery, but discussing Newton and so forth, and Bentley's editions. What's going on there?
Well, that's a really good question. Can everyone hear me, by the way? Is that coming through? Okay, great. Because I think I really liked Michael's cosmic remarks, because it's very, very tempting to imagine that there was this extremely deep thought going on at this time amongst these people who were also on the other side of the coin great pleasure lovers and enjoyed, discourse, fun, conviviality. And I think what drew me to the Temple of Sleep certainly was the way in which those things seemed to converge, this sort of elusive meaning to this building, with hiding behind an apparent playfulness of form and dedication and decoration. I think our subject, scratch the surface and you get more than you bargained for, might be a nice way of summarising it. But Michael, do you want to speak to the sort of the cosmic in Vanbrugh?
My guess is most of it was sorted out in London. They met up frequently as a Kit Kat club. They would have popped into each other's houses. They would have seen each other very frequently. But there is undoubtedly a change in 1718, 1719, when Vanbrugh gets involved with Stowe. Giles Worsley picked up on that too. And I think that has to be Cobham. Although it's clearly Vanbrugh who applied the Greco-Roman foot to 5 of his buildings. That can't have been Cobham. He must have handed it over to his architect to do it. But where the buildings were built, I suspect that's Cobham instructing him. And he had his own intellectual agenda. And it is complex at that period. And I think a lot of it is religious. And I think a lot of it derives from a wonderful tension at Stowe. And here I just didn't have time to go into this at all. But Cobham has money, obviously. He inherited it from his father. But the money used, I think, at Stowe during Vanbrugh's period and subsequently came from his wife. And she was a brewery heiress, the Anchor Brewery in London. And I think I'm right in saying that she didn't have access to the capital, nor did Cobham, but the income. So you have to imagine so many £1 million equivalent income per year. She's not going to put it into Stowe until she's got Cobham to sort Stowe out. It was going to be inherited by entailment by a cousin. So in 1717, Cobham buys that person out, William Temple, for £7,000. And that's the year they put up the new inn. That's the year Vanbrugh must have been planning the Stowe gardens and buildings. And it went on up to 1719, 1720. And she would have said, that's my money, we're doing this each year, which is why you get 3 dozen Grade 1 listed buildings at Stowe within the same period of time. But I think she was linked much more. She came from a London set, being brought up with Mrs. Delaney and things like that. And so she would have been much more attracted to traditional Christian views like Robert Nelson, whereas Cobham was much more sympathetic to atheists. So then you had this wonderful tension where one would say, I'll have that, okay, you have that, and I'll put this one up in contrast. And that, I think, drove it to a large extent. Sorry, I could go on forever.
No, well,
stop me.
I might remind people that we have recorded this event, so that was for the benefit perhaps of people who couldn't be here today, but some of us might want to look at some of it again, and I think Michael's slides were complex and we'd need to look at those in more detail, so that would be something to bear in mind. And does the just before we come to the floor, Francis, do you think that does square with this idea that even though Vanbrugh dies, Cobham does not move on to Gibbs and the living architect, and is even willing to take risks on the buildings, on the north portico, with this theory of yours that the Corinthian order has to give way to the Scamozzi Ionic?
Yeah, I mean, I think
despite the elongation of the columns?
It was his wife's money, and it wasn't his. You think about Blenheim, Castle Howard, they're all stone buildings. Stowe was a red brick building at this time. He wasn't smashing it down, he was just altering and adapting. I think I suppose actually coming from a lot of the talks is that clients, this is my experience as an architect, is that people think architects design things, but they're just the midwives to a client's vision very often. Well, even my Castle Howard one, people underplay how important an architect is. And that's why I think the North Front was, after Vanbrugh's death, and I have a later view than Michael, that he would just say, right, I've got the drawings, I'm not going to pay an architect from London to come up, it'll be expensive, I'll just do it with the master mason. And the master mason, maybe he did those capitals in Northampton, I don't know, but they're so conventional, and you look at Vanbrugh's capitals and they're so kind of idiosyncratic and so on. So I suppose, I can't remember, where am I going with this?
Well, no, that I think where you've gone is very helpful, and it actually gives me a chance to just mention that if you read Christine Casey's new wonderful book on the crafted surface, you'll see that she speculates there that the frequency with which the Scamozzi capital is used, the Ionic capital, may be less to do with a question of taste and more to do with the fact that the masons around the country knew how to do it.
Yes,
and it's therefore cheaper.
That's
more
an interesting
efficient
point. And I suppose the thing I wanted to say was that if you looked at the Scamozzi in detail, the top moulding has got the water leaf on the original, and the band below is plain, and then all of these ones that come from Wren onwards all the way up to Adam don't have a decorative band at the top, and they have their decoration lower down, and they're all the same. So they obviously just worked out that's what an Ionic capital looks like, unless the architect like Vanbrugh says, no, I want to do something special.
Yeah.
That's why.
Yeah. Let's come to the floor. I'm sure there'll be some questions from the floor. Or are you all stunned into silence by what we've heard? Yeah, down here. I don't know if you can reach, or perhaps you can shout out. The microphone's coming.
30 years afterwards, in the 1750s, we had a great florowit of particularly English and Scots going to the Middle East and to the Mediterranean, telling the rest of us that they had discovered perfect classical proportions. But you're suggesting that this actually was being discussed and implemented a great deal earlier than Adam and Stuart and so on.
Sorry, who was that for?
Talk.
Good. If I could just add a comment on that. I have actually just written something for the Records of Buckinghamshire which describes a lot of Vanbrugh's work at Stowe as his Levantine domain. Now, I don't know whether that means anything to you, but if you look at a number of his buildings at Stowe, Vanbrugh's buildings, they're taken from the Levant, by which I mean the west coast of Turkey, Lebanon, right down to Egypt, which came under the Levant Company. The Levant Company was the second most powerful after the East India. And there were numerous links with Nelson, Robert Nelson, and others, and including the Levant Company paid for probably the main ambassador for Britain, which was at Constantinople. And from 1717, that was Cobham's cousin. The whole thing, I think, can be seen as them being aware of these details. I mean, even if you take the Kent ceiling in the North Hall, that has the 7 planets plus a zodiac. Now, it clearly is an imitation from Kircher, 1650, and that refers to the celestial harmony of the spheres. That influenced Newton and others. But it also is in the North Additon of the Temple of Bel at Palmyra. And the temple of the Garter room at Stowe has the South Additon on the roof. So you then think, well, actually, perhaps they knew a lot more than we give it for. They weren't published, but there must have been numerous chaplains from Aleppo, who had brought that in. One of the details is the cisterns from Tyre, and that was published by Henry Mondrell in 1703, and he was a chaplain at Aleppo. So I think you can see that they were collecting these details, and the brilliance of Vanbrugh was he could turn it into whatever he wanted to, even the tetrapylon or the tetrachionion of the Queen's monument. So actually, I think it forms a very important, very early form of architectural influence in Britain, which hasn't been recognised previously.
Would it be fair to say, I mean, during your talk, Michael, and I think somebody else also mentioned it, the 1720s is the time when Vanbrugh starts to go a bit Palladian. And this has often been talked about in relation, of course, to the Temple of the Four Winds at Castle Howard. But are we thinking that perhaps it's not so much an aesthetic reaction by Vanbrugh to what's going on in politics and in the politics of the Office of Works, but actually something that Cobham is leading?
It's Cobham and Wren. So you can date this very accurately. The Bridgeman plan shows the different walkways put in by Bridgeman, or that bird's eye drawing. One of them, called the Great Crosswalk, no, sorry, not the Great Cross, one of them, Lee's Walk, they dug out the ha-ha in 1719. The next year, they had to fill it in again and had to pay or give extra beer to all the poor people who, we dug this out last year, now he's falling. Why? The Rotondo. The Rotondo is the most incredible building, I think, from the 18th century. And that has the Greco-Roman foot in it, time and again. It has astronomical associations. I better not go into all of them. But I don't think... Cobham was into astronomy. He went down in 1724 to Bath to watch the great eclipse. And Halley had predicted the eclipse of 1715. There were 2 eclipses, total solar eclipses, and then none for another 200 years. It was all the rage. And the first one was 17 miles, the epicenter 17 miles away from Stowe. So Cobham was really into this. And Desaguliers, who was Newton's helper, was there giving lectures in Bath. And Cobham was involved, final point, I could go on about the astronomy, have to read it in the other article. But Cobham was actually a pew holder in St James Piccadilly. The rector of St James Piccadilly was the Reverend Samuel Clarke. He was the protege of Newton. He was up there, some people reckon almost the equivalent up to in terms of mathematics. And I've come across a translation of Samuel Clarke's edition of Caesar's Wars, all in Latin, and he dedicated it to the Duke of Marlborough. And Cobham, I think, it's called R.T., Richard Temple, translated that 1713, and it's all in praise of liberty and the current or the hoped-for Hanoverian regime. So I think a lot of it would have been sorted out in London, and they were into this whole concept of absolute space and whether or not it supported a Christian viewpoint, omnipresence in the of God's presence. So,
well, that seems a pretty big point on which we could perhaps draw to a conclusion this session. I'm sure there'll be, I wouldn't mind betting there'll be some questions for you downstairs, Michael, over in this very brief break we're going to have, or certainly over a glass of something strong a bit later on. But we'll move on. We've heard today wonderfully how Francis has been in conversation with Cobham and Vanbrugh in his dreams, and we've seen the effects of it. And please do look at the drawings downstairs if you haven't already. And Tom has brought us to the world of dreams as well with the temple, and Michael's taken us into this extremely arcane but very fascinating area in his talk. So thank you to our speakers. We'll take a 15-minute break and start again at 5.